Brian Katulis, our guest speaker this evening, will address the question, after 19 months of war in Gaza, with spillover into Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, and Syria, is there a new Middle East? And if there is, or even if it's partially the case, is there some way for the United States to help shape it into a more stable region? President Trump is in that region today. And while his main aim seems to be making business deals, he's also making geopolitical history. I have to tell you, and as you probably know, just a few days ago, he lifted economic sanctions on Syria. He met with Syria's new leader, President Ahmed al-Sharaa, in Riyadh on Wednesday. The President of the United States actually shook hands with a former al-Qaeda leader, albeit an al-Qaeda leader who played a lead role in the 14-year war in Syria against the Assad regime. Speaking of Syria, 2 weeks ago, as many of you will recall, Robert Ford, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, spoke before this very audience. The video of his presentation, which is really a collector's item, I think, has now been posted on our website. Mr. Ford, or former Ambassador Ford, lays out in his presentation, as you recall, the definitive case for lifting sanctions. I think I could say, although this may be at several removes, the President followed his advice. So Baltimore Council members and attendees may be the best informed people of anybody in the general public on the story behind the story. Brian Katulis is a noted scholar of the Middle East. He is a senior fellow at the much admired Middle East Institute in Washington, and he's a highly regarded expert on Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. He's also a senior advisor to the Albright Stonebridge group of consultants on subjects like the Middle East. Among his many publications is one that came out at the beginning of this week. It is a quarterly review of American policy in the Middle East. We included a link on the invitation to tonight, and Brian brought a few hard copies to hand out today. This is what it looks like, and it'll be on the table. In fact, it's on the table at the back. We don't have quite enough for everybody, but we have quite a few. It is a critical review of administration policy, and in my view, it hit the nail on the head for its judgments on the day it was published, which was, I think, last Monday. But now with President Trump's trip, it may need an updating. Brian is a graduate of Villanova University, which Pope Leo also attended, although a few years earlier. There he studied history and Arab and Islamic studies. He got his master's degree in public affairs at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. So Brian, once again, the question, is there a new Middle East? I turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thanks, Roy. Thank you, Roy, and thanks for all of you showing up tonight instead of being at home, having dinner with your families and things like this. I'm going to spend 25 minutes offering some remarks, but the thing I want to get to is the interactive, your questions and things like this. I want to thank the Baltimore Council for what it does, because I'm an American who grew up 30, 40 years ago, not far from here in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and I believe that America is a force for good in the world and that we should stay engaged in the world. And what you do in coming to hear me talk tonight, hear our colleague Robert Ford and others, and think about these issues is essential to actually building the coalitions and the ideas of how America stays engaged in the world. And what I'm going to do tonight, and I'll do three main things, is talk about this complicated region of the world. But before I do that, I want to say, Roy, thank you for having me here tonight. I don't know if Roy has told you this. He's leaving tomorrow. How many people know this? He's leaving tomorrow for Syria. And Roy's been working on this book on Syria, which I read the earlier draft of it, looked through it, and it's a tremendous work, but he's got to rewrite it because some things have changed in Syria. I don't know if you've noticed, right? Yeah. But your commitment to actually taking time out of your schedule, but then risking it's not easy to go to Syria these days, even though it's not what it used to be. Thank you for doing that. Briefly, before I get into sort of the structure of my talk, and I'll go till about 7, we'll open it up and things like that. Let me tell you a little bit more about the Middle East Institute. We've been around since 1946. We're a .edu, so check us out at mei.edu. Our three main missions, our main mission is to help Americans understand and connect with this complicated part of the world and really explore and understand the depth of all of that. So number one, we do policy. This paper, which you can pick up back there, is to try to explain sort of what's going on. And I'm sure we'll talk about Trump and the jumbo jet and Qatar and all these other issues. But we try to explore it with sort of a sense of depth and how does America connect with the society, despite all of it, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, and other places. And I lived in the Palestinian territories, including in Gaza, for about 3 years in the 1990s. So I'm happy to talk about all of these other issues. So our education is our mission. Policy is our mission. Second is culture and arts. So if you come down, and please come down, you're not that far. You're like 45 minutes on a good traffic day. Yeah. Yeah. When is that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Roy said it took him 2 hours to get here this afternoon. We have a wonderful art gallery. Like, I love the fact that every morning I wake up, go into the office, and the first thing that I see is beautiful art. And right now we've got an exhibition of art from Iran, from women who've produced art that is just a beautiful expression of life. And I sometimes spend a couple minutes sort of just looking at it and thinking about, okay, this is what connects us. And then we have an educational mission. We have a library and things like that. But Roy told you my bio, my background and things like this. Let me tell you one more thing before I get into the talk. I am a husband, and I'm a father of a 14-year-old boy. My wife is a career U.S. government employee still. There's a lot of uncertainty. She's still in the game. She sort of has a parallel career inside of U.S. intelligence agencies. And our son Ben is 14 years old right now. But about 8-9 years ago, he would be asked, "What does mom do? What is her job?" She's like, "Mom." He was like, "Mom protects us from bad guys." She's in those communities and things like that. What does Dad do? Dad does blah, blah, blah about what mom does. He talks about like what we do in the world. And I just talks about sort of our connection to the world and assesses what we do. And that's my stock and trade in assessing U.S. foreign policy. And what I'll do tonight is three things. One, the question of, is there a new Middle East? I'll talk for about 8-10 minutes about that. Second, you might be interested, but Trump's approach and his trip to the Middle East. I'll say a few things. And then lastly, I'll talk about a preview of coming attractions, the things that you should be watching in the news. Because what we do and what I do is try to give people tools to understand what's going on and not be polemical about it, not be partisan or ideological, but try to understand, okay, what's going on in this place, and are we doing any good, or are we doing more harm than good? And that's essentially sort of my mission in life and what MEI does. So first, is there a new Middle East? Okay, here we are in May of 2025. I want to sort of structure this in three ways. Number one, three people. Three people who are at the center of this trip that Trump is doing to the Middle East. Mohammed bin Salman, who I've met about 7 or 8 times, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Ahmed Ashara, the president of Syria, which I hope you'll meet, Roy, on your trip, the de facto president, and then finally Donald Trump himself. Think back to where these three individuals were 10 years ago. Let's start with Ahmed Ashara. He was essentially the leader of a faction of Al-Qaeda. And think about that. Al-Qaeda aligned with ISIS and all of these different movements, and we were mounting a campaign 2014, 2015 to go after people like him. He is now the de facto president of Syria, was in Riyadh yesterday and met President Trump. He was fighting the Assad regime, which I'm sure you've heard from Robert Ford, he was the ambassador there. He was the guy that essentially was trying to topple the Assad regime, and the Assad regime was responsible for most of the deaths and destruction of what was going on there, to be clear. And the U.S., I'm happy to, in the Q&A, litigate whether Obama did it right or wrong, and other things that I'm sure Robert Ford covered it. But Ahmed Ashara was there, and now he's the president of Syria, and I think has an important moment to sort of lift up his country and lead it there. Where was MBS? I actually met MBS in 2014, 15. He was a minor prince among many. And if you look at the family tree of the Saudi dynasty, if you will, no one knew for certain that he was going to lead to what he did. And he's done a lot of bad, and he's done a lot of good, in my view. We can talk about sort of the positives and negatives, but the personality of Mohammed bin Salman and who he is and how hard he works. He essentially, before King Abdullah died and passed away, his father, Mohammed bin Salman, son of Salman, it was uncertain that he would actually rise to the way that he did. And I've met him several times. But today, he is the person that is actually remaking not only his country, but I think parts of the Middle East. And in ways that I'll talk about and why I think yes. My answer, bottom line to your question, is there a new Middle East? Yes, there is. It's because of figures like him. It's because of, and not to sort of praise him, because he certainly has done a lot of awful things against human rights activists, Jamal Khashoggi, and other things. But he has a vision about where he wants to go. The third person is Donald Trump. Does anyone remember where Donald Trump was about 10 years ago? He was finishing The Apprentice, and there was a series where there was a pie fight between. So imagine this, and imagine how things can change. And you all, many of you, have some more years than I do on you in your lives. Things can change pretty rapidly. But Donald Trump, who now is being feted with all of these camels and processions and royal processions and things that he loves. He was essentially a reality TV show star. He was a businessman, and he did certain things, and he captured the imagination of a slice of American public, and we should admit that that's there. But it is what it is, and he is engaging in this region, and I'll get to the second part of how his trip is going. But I've lived in the Middle East for about 30 years or so, gone back and forth. I go about once a month. My colleague Athena and I were just in Oman with about 8 or 9 other colleagues last month, and we could talk about sort of what we heard from Oman. It is, I think, fundamentally, the first part I would say is that it's changing in 3 big ways, the broader region. Number one, economically. The oil-rich countries of the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Oman, are not simply just squandering their oil wealth in the way that they did in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. They are structuring things in a number of different entities, the sovereign wealth funds of the region, the things that Trump has been attracted to, which I'll talk about in his trip, the things that connect with the finance and venture capital and private equity here in the United States. They are looking to use these resources to do 2 big things. Number one, diversify their economy away from oil and fossil fuels towards a broader strategy of connecting with the global economy. And the global economy includes the United States, especially the United States, the biggest economy in the world, despite a lot of, in my view, unforced errors in the last 2-3 months on tariffs and other things. There is a depth and quality to our equity markets, to our bond markets. They want to connect, much more so than China, Europe, and other places. So that's one thing that they're doing, is that they're actually looking to use the economic tools that they have. A second thing that they're doing is the social reforms in some of these countries. And I want to highlight social and not political. Social meaning this. When I first went to Saudi Arabia many, many years ago, you could not see women. They were not in positions of power. You had religious police on the streets and in other places. And you go today, and it's kids are doing what they're doing. If you're in your 20s, you're out at a coffee shop, you're going out on a date, you're connecting with, and it's open and it's out and open. But to be clear, it's not political at all. It is still an absolute monarchy. And if you sort of criticize the people and the powers that be, they will literally, in some cases, throw you in jail or kill you and things like this. So I'm not shilling for any of these countries. They have a particular model that is, I think, attractive in many ways to our current president. Hey, that's a good laugh line. Economic reform, social reform, geopolitical change in the Middle East, and why I think there's a change in the Middle East. And it's a very complicated story, but essentially a lot of these countries in the broader Middle East, especially those that have the wealth and resources, still look to the U.S. despite all of our faults, our divisions, January 6th, all of these strategic uncertainties, the tariff wars and things like this, still look to the United States as the preferred strategic partner of choice for a couple of reasons. Number one, we've got still the most powerful military in the world and in the region. China has not yet done anything to protect any of these countries against the threats that they face. Second, they see, despite all of the pendulum swings in our politics, they prefer to work with us. And this is what you're seeing in sort of the Trump administration and the second Trump 2.0. They prefer to work with us than they do with Xi or Putin in Russia, in part because they see there's a certain potential in our economy and our strategic depth and our military. Geopolitically, they've started to hedge a little bit because they see the uncertainty, the divisions in our own politics. But the new Middle East is there because of the economic, social changes that are coming, but also how they're positioning themselves that they never did before in a geopolitical landscape that has changed, that has become much more multipolar. I will qualify all of this in that it's not all roses and wonderful. And as you see this in Yemen, you see this in the Gaza Strip, and I lived in the Gaza Strip, can talk a little bit about that in the 1990s, is that the Middle East today is, in some ways, I've used this analogy, similar to the Wild West in the 1800s in America. There are pockets where people are pursuing dreams of gold and the gold rush and other things. And there's also pockets of chaos and violence. And the places where there's violence, it is devastating. We see this every day if you're paying attention to what's happening inside of Gaza, inside of places like Yemen where there's still internal conflict, where people are living day to day. So it's a tale of two regions, in a sense. But by and large, and I think this is what Trump has tapped into, which leads me to the second part of my talk, going on here a little bit longer, and I'll move more rapidly, is that Trump, and I'm a critic of him if you look at my papers, and I try to be analytic about it, he essentially obviously doesn't fit any mold that we've seen from any president. The closest that I could think of is Andrew Jackson, way back in the 1800s, where he's tapping into a sort of a populist sentiment at a time when America is so deeply connected to the rest of the world and is performing different moves that I think he has stepped back from on his tariff wars, in part because the sort of the weight of the bond markets and the economy has forced him to do that. But Trump, in a sense, has looked at the Middle East and why he's made his first trip overseas, the first planned trip, because he went to Rome for Pope Francis's funeral. That was not planned. He has seen the Middle East, I think rightly, as an arena for geostrategic competition. It's a place that, for most of our lifetimes, was seen as a place that was civil wars, regional wars, Iran and Iraq, terrorists exporting their threats to the United States, most visibly in the 9/11 attacks. He sees what's happening and what I talked about in terms of what these countries are doing and the next generation to use their resources. He sees this as some potential for America, but also it's a bridge region between China, Europe, and the United States, the key engines of the global economy. It's not simply just about exporting oil and other things. It's a place that actually wants to transform itself. And there's some wisdom in that. And it pains me as someone who's been a critic of Trump to say that. I think President Biden actually caught on to this about a year into his presidency, and I've written about this, that President Biden really did not want to do much with the Middle East. If you remember in his first year, we had COVID, we had a lot of problems at home. He wanted to restore alliances in Europe and Asia. I get it, I was with it. But he didn't really wake up to the fact that the Middle East is strategically important for America until Russia invaded Ukraine. And I know that sounds crazy to you, but why? When Russia invaded Ukraine, remember what happened? Oil prices jumped up really high. Food prices jumped up real high. There was a debate inside the Biden administration that said, we need to actually have a more stable relationship with Saudi Arabia. We actually need to work with these countries of the region. All of our visions of a green economy and transformation to a clean economy, we still believe in that. But pragmatically, when you're looking at inflation in America and all of these other factors, we need to actually stabilize these relationships. So Biden himself doubled down. He went to Riyadh, he went to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in the summer of 2022. There's a pragmatic recognition in America. There's a consensus, believe it or not. Like on foreign policy, despite all of our partisan divisions, the media and ideological divisions, there's a general, you get outside of the bubble. A lot of people understand China's a big competitor. Russia's not doing a lot of good. We've got to work together to do this. So Trump recognized this, and I think the reason why he went to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, it wasn't simply for the bling. We can talk about the bling and the luxury jets and things that he hopes to get. But someone, either him or someone on his team, understands that these issues are fundamentally important for positioning America in a changing multipolar world. That you can't simply look at the Middle East as a region that you rebalance or pivot away from to deal with China. That it's an arena for competition where China is showing up with its AI and its technology. And that we've got to show up and notice this. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm a big Trump supporter, but he showed up with the titans of our industry that essentially said, we want to engage in this silver linings playbook that I talk about, that you guys want to do something good for your populations. We want to do something good here. Let's make a deal. And there's a lot of problems with that. You look under the hood. We'll talk about that in the Q&A and some of my comments of what to look forward to next. The second thing I'd say about the Trump move, and Roy will see this in Syria, but the galvanizing effect, despite all of the mistakes that we've made in the Middle East, the Iraq War in 2003 and that debacle, people still want to come back to us. And this is the amazing thing, is that people still want to come here. And the fact that we had an immigration challenge on the southern border is that we still, at least we'll see what happens after the next couple of years with Trump, but people still want to come here as opposed to going to China and Beijing and other places. They look to us. Top leaders in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, other places still look to us. And the move that Trump made, which I think was most important, that is historic, is his move to actually say, look, Syria, this country that was under sanctions essentially since 1979, the country that Roy's going to go visit, he actually saw, or someone on his team saw, that this is part of the chessboard, and I know Ambassador Ford talked about this, that we need to bring these countries closer to sort of the network that we have, as opposed to what Iran and other countries have, that terrorist groups have used for decades. And I'm quite surprised that he did this, because if you look at, I don't know if you know Sebastian Gorka, he's a top counterterrorism advisor in Trump's team. 2-3 days before Trump's visit, he gave an interview to a top Saudi media outlet for 15 minutes. And he basically said, Ahmed Ashara, the de facto president of Syria, he's a jihadist. And once a jihadist, never jihadist, always a jihadist. And we can never work with him. And this is an interesting thing for some of my friends who are working for Trump or are about to go to work for Trump, is that no matter what you say in a meeting, your boss can actually overrule you in a second. They're not really stitched together. He runs his, as I've written before, and some people don't like it, he runs his White House like a Middle East dictatorship, like a monarch. He can decide and then others implement. And essentially, and I think this was in this case the right decision, that the Syrian people in December of last year, as Robert Ford told you, if those of you who were here at the last talk, rose up against their leader. And their leader had no legitimacy. They had killed hundreds of thousands of people, tortured them. And the fact that Trump essentially said we're going to lift any of these barriers to doing investment in Syria, I think is an important strategic move that with everything with Trump, you have to ask the question, will he follow through? Will there be follow through? Are there people on his team that do this? So I think that's really important. And in this trip, I think that was sort of the big headline besides the economic deals. We can talk about the bling and the Qatari luxury jet and things like that. But that is an important move. The two things that I think are left unattended are the Israeli-Palestinian question. And I love to talk about this because as Trump was going through the palaces of Riyadh and Doha and Abu Dhabi, Israel was mounting an even more aggressive campaign that I think will get harsher against the Hamas militants, but then has extreme human cost. And I can dance, by the way, if you'd like. I'm a pretty good dancer. Yeah, we can join the party afterwards. Yeah. So one thing to watch is the Israeli-Palestinian file, because so far on this trip there has not been big headlines about progress there. Trump himself wants to get the Nobel Prize because he thinks that Barack Obama should have never gotten it in 2009 for simply being not George W. Bush. But he wants to essentially say the Israel-Saudi normalization that I think will come inevitably is a key part of the equation. But the things that weren't addressed in this trip on the Israel-Palestine file, I think are potentially things that actually could bubble up and cause problems for his overall agenda for looking at the region as a place where we can do investment. The second thing to watch briefly is Iran. And Athena and I and a few other colleagues were in Oman. Sorry, we didn't go to Iran. But they are mediating the talks between the United States and Iran. And it seems like, from all accounts, and most recently this afternoon talking to Omani officials, that Trump and the Iranians are proceeding with a deal that may not be dissimilar to what we saw in 2015. There may be certain features that offer different guarantees and assurances to the Israelis, but I think it would be a good thing, in my view, that the United States and Iran find some sort of diplomatic solution as opposed to a military solution, but leads to more conversations about Iran and what it does with terrorist groups, what it does with proxy groups in Hezbollah in Lebanon and other places. And to me, if you look at the report card assessment that I provided, the highest grade that I give to the Trump team is that it actually is looking to use the leverage of U.S. military presence and other places to essentially start the conversation with Iran, which I think is much progressed, about how do we actually make sure that they never get a nuclear weapon, and actually assure ourselves, Iran, Israel, and other partners that they'll never move to that place. So, Trump trip we can talk a little bit more about. I know he's in Abu Dhabi. He's flying back. There were some hints that he might go to Turkey. I don't think that's happening. He was a bit naive about his mediation skills and saying that he can end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. I think that's going to be much longer. Let me close with, I've gone over time, but three things to watch for, and I've alluded to some of them, and we can use this as a jump-off point for the Q&A. Number one, I would look for how Trump positions himself on the Israel-Palestine equation of things. And if you look at what President Trump has done in the last couple of weeks, he essentially has very subtly, and in some cases not so subtly, distanced himself from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his preferred approach, Netanyahu's preferred approach on a couple of key issues. we were in Oman, and the Omanis brokered a deal between the Houthis in Yemen and the United States to basically stop the fighting between the two of them. But the Houthis had said, we're still going to fire on Israel. And if I were in Israel, I would be deeply concerned about this decision that Trump made. Second, Trump had tried, in the way that the Biden team has, in negotiations with Qatar and Egypt between Israel and Hamas, to broker a broader deal for more hostage releases and a ceasefire. He got extremely frustrated, including Steve Witkoff, with the current Israeli government, and essentially said, we're going to talk to Hamas directly. And we got Idan Alexander, the United States did, the last living American out from Gaza. This is, again, Trump manifesting his America First approach, and it's one which Israel, I think, is deeply concerned about, or at least Netanyahu is as well. And the third is just the fact that Americans are continuing with a fifth round of talks with Iran, and some call it indirect, but as we know, a lot of it has been very direct, and that President Trump does not want another stupid war in the Middle East. And I say this as someone, again, who's very skeptical about what he's doing in America and other things, but he's got, I think, the right approach of trying to pursue tough diplomacy with Iran to see if there's an accommodation that can be achieved. So the first thing to watch for is what he does on the U.S.-Israel front and how coordinated that is with the current prime minister. The second is where we go with Iran, and I've talked a little bit about this, but it simply should not be about the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal is important. Making sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon, I think, is tantamount. But it's also the discussion should include about what Iran does to threaten Israel and several of our other partners on a daily basis with different groups, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen. And I understand the sequencing of you need to talk about nuclear talks first, but then second about their presence and their support for terrorism in the region. And then lastly, this is a bigger question, and we can sort of use this as a jump-off point for the Q&A, and sorry for going on long here, is that I think there are bigger questions that we as Americans should face about Trump's current engagement in the Middle East. And I hope I didn't sugarcoat it, because there's a certain part of what the Trump administration is doing with this current trip that I think should give us as Americans pause. What he's doing to not only provide financial and economic benefit to the United States as a country, which I believe is important to do, but what he's doing to garner support for his own corporations and the people around him about this. And again, I'm not making a political statement, but it is unprecedented when you look at what his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has done in terms of the amounts of money that they're receiving and investing in the advice that he's giving with some of the same people that Trump's meeting as a government official. Or Steve Witkoff, who is the special envoy in the Middle East, his son, weeks before all of this, crafting deals on cryptocurrency in Abu Dhabi and other places. Or Donald Jr., and we were in Oman, we heard about all of this, and it's unprecedented. Like, again, we can talk about Joe Biden and his son and pay to play and things like this. This is off the charts in terms of blurring the lines between what the government does as the United States government that represents the American people and our economic interests, and then what the potential financial personal gains are. And I'm glad to see some, but not a lot, some Republicans lifting their voice up about all of this. And of course, you may ask about, and I've been to Qatar, friendly with Qatar and all of this, but their offer of a luxury jetliner, which in many ways has overshadowed this trip, which, understand my point, I think this is a hugely historic trip for the United States to essentially say we're going to look at the region not as a place of war and terror, but of a place where we can do deals. And we want to support the people who have a future in the vision. And why would you sully that? Why would you have the shadow of a personal benefit from the Qataris and the Qataris, which have problems, who have supported Hamas and other groups and things like this, and accept a $500 million luxury jet? Again, I don't mean to be doing an anti-Trump diatribe. That's not what I'm doing here. It's sort of this is the one thing that I hope our system, if this moves forward, that we talk about and say, wait a second, there should be limits. And there should be limits between what the government does for the American people and the benefit of the American economy and what is done for the benefit of corporate interests and private interests of certain individuals. So on that happy note, I do think, to answer the question, there is a new Middle East. The question that we all face, I think, is where are we as Americans? What do we stand for as Americans? Do we stand for a lot of the values that in many ways I think the Trump administration has downgraded, and it's not a new process. I think other administrations, Democratic and Republican, have downgraded a lot of these values. And what type of America are we going to engage? Because I think Middle East is changing, and I actually think some more positives outweigh the benefit, the negatives of the benefits, as bad as the negatives are and as big as they are. And it really comes back to us and whether we're actually going to stay true to who we are and demand that our leaders actually stand for who we are when we engage these countries in the region. So thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Of course, we know that Trump is over in the Middle East making a deal for himself and his family. My question is this. How do you think that Israel, what do you think their reaction is going to be, knowing their position with those in the Middle East, and what kind of backlash you think that we're going to receive from Israel? Or do you think that we have gotten to a place where we're over Israel? Because in the past, Israel has always used us for war and et cetera in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So how do you think this is going to pass in the eyesight of Israel? And secondly, how does this move benefit the average American? When I heard rumor about his tax plan, I'm talking about Trump's tax plan, if you make under $15,000, he's going to try to raise it to 74%
right.
in your taxes.
Yeah.
And if you make between 20 and 30,
yeah.
he's going to raise your taxes 20%.
Yeah.
So how do you think this is going to pan out with the American people, where his family is making money, and yet our taxes are going up significantly,
yeah.
especially with the movement of the MAGA group that put him in there.
Right.
Because at this point, none of these benefits are going to benefit
ordinary Americans,
people,
working
especially
Americans.
with the tax going up. Okay,
right.
we make more money as a country, but how does that trickle down to the average individual whose taxes may go up 74%?
It doesn't.
And 20.
Yeah, it doesn't. But I'll tackle both questions, and those are, Bishop, thank you very much for those thoughtful questions. First on Israel, what I would say, and I lived not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but in Israel for many years, and I go there regularly. We often talk about Israel as a monolith, and it's not. And it's a very divided society, much more divided, if you can believe it, than our own society. And the current prime minister is probably one of the most deeply unpopular prime ministers. And you can see this in the near daily for almost 2 years before October 7th, more than 2 years, protests against him and the moves that he was making and things like that. So there are a lot of good people in Israel who are already calling into question the fact that Netanyahu's strategy seemingly has isolated Israel from the broader region. And it's not only because this complicated question of how do you get to security and a sense of strategic deterrence against your adversaries, like Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, but how do you get hostages home? How do you get people home? What's the end state and things like this? And I think this trip has already prompted a debate inside of Israel about what do we want to stand for? Do we want to stand for more integration, like the sort of things that we saw in 2020 with the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco? And those sorts of things will never, I'm telling you right now, it will never happen with Saudi Arabia unless there's some sort of pathway towards some sort of decent settlement with the Palestinians. And I understand how that's difficult for a lot of Israelis who've seen their people slaughtered by Hamas and the militants, but the vast majority of ordinary Palestinians are decent people. I talk to them every day. I worked with them. They want what you and I want, which is sort of a sense of decency. They want their kids to have good schools and opportunity and things like this. We don't have, in my assessment, an Israeli leader that actually leads. And there are leaders like Menachem Begin, who sat down with Anwar Sadat, if you all remember that, in the Israel-Egypt Accords more than 40 years ago. Or Yitzhak Rabin, who lost his life in part because he was trying to forge forward with a path with the Palestinians. And extremists on the Israeli side killed him, Yigal Amir. And the vision that Yigal Amir had, I think, is unfolding in parts of this current Israeli government. So I think Israel won't have, the current leadership will have a reaction that says, wait a second, we're not cool with talks with Iran. We're really concerned about this separate deal that you cut with Houthis. But there will be other Israelis who essentially say, look, our pathway actually should be towards what Trump is trying to do in binding the region together with India, with China, with the rest of the world, with the global economy, and we want to be part of that. And what I'm going to be watching for the next few months and the next year is that debate inside of Israel, because despite all of its flaws, it has an open sort of raucous, like the parameters of the debate about Israel, by the way, are much wider over there than I think at times than it is over here. So I think part of the reaction will be the current powers that be will be, wait a second, we got to claw back and we got to control what Trump is trying to do here. But essentially, like Trump essentially has said, if you don't have a clear pathway to end the war in Gaza and bring hostages home, we're going to go our own way and we're going to try to use our leverage against them. The second question is really interesting. A little bit, yeah, go for it, yeah.
With deference to the bishop, we don't do domestic politics.
Okay, he doesn't want me to talk about domestic politics. And I'll be analytic about it. I won't sort of do the class warfare, other things and things like this. But I do think what I would say, as someone who's more in the center, in the vital center, is that the different policies and the thing, when Trump comes back from his trip, I was explaining this to an ambassador from the region today at lunch. Most Americans in DC certainly won't be talking about Trump's trip. Like, we have attention deficit disorder, and the biggest thing that Washington's going to be talking about, at least for the next couple of weeks, will be the budget. And how do you...
Beautiful bill.
The big, beautiful bill. And again, I don't want to be political about this, but the main thing that I would say is that a lot of the things that Trump, his appeal to a lot of the working class in the last elections, and I'm just being clinical about this, I think we've already seen some worries about the rise in prices at grocery stores, the tariff wars, and other things. There's going to be a backlash there. And I'm not going to favor Republicans versus Democrats, but there's an opportunity, I think, for others, whether in the Republican Party or Democrats who are concerned about this, to offer a different alternative. What I think has been lacking, and this is interesting, in this context of trade wars and tariffs and other things like this, is there hasn't been an answer that feels good to a lot of Americans, most Americans, about how we connect to the global economy in a way that helps benefit our workers. And I think Trump has a proposition under play right here, and we'll see if it works out. We'll see if the Saudis actually, the commitments that they've made in $650 billion of investments in the United States, if you look underneath the hood, and some of our colleagues at MEI have looked at it, Saudis don't really actually have that money. As rich as we think they all are, they still have some challenges in funding the projects that they have themselves. So these are wealthy but small countries that don't have an infinite supply of wealth. And we should join their party in a second. They're much more, maybe more interesting than I am. But Bishop, I don't want to be political and things like this, but you're asking the right question without sort of, I don't want to cause divisions here and things like this, is that the interlinkage between domestic and international policies are something that we need to address when we think about things like Trump's trip to the Middle East, how he's engaging and how his family company and other things like this are engaging these parts, and how do we actually benefit from that? Because I actually think we at the Middle East Institute, I firmly believe it, is like a deeper connection to the Middle East, is something that actually can, if with full understanding, can benefit all Americans. Who's next?
The Palestine situation. You've been to Gaza, I have not, but the hate there is so intense, and it's brewing. How do you see this ending? That's it.
Yeah, well, that's the big question, and I think the only way that it really ends is if we have leaders who remember the humanity of people on all sides. And what troubles me the most, in having lived there and talking to friends, I've written about him, and I can send you a couple of articles with his permission. I've written about my friend Bassam Nasser, who has 4 kids. His wife's a pharmacist. They've moved 5 or 6 times. He works for Catholic Relief Services, which I think is headquartered here in Baltimore. I think he got pink slipped during the USAID cuts. A lot of these people, despite his teenage daughters seeing their families, their friends' families being killed, he still is at his core, we have to live together. And so what you framed, and you started with sort of this hatred, I think is the thing that the media in the United States focuses on, and the anger, and the activists do this as well. But we forget about the ordinary, basic human decency of ordinary people who just want to live their lives and want to move on and live in coexistence. And despite 40 or 50,000 people being killed in Gaza as a result of this devastating war, hospitals being attacked, all of these other things, what I'm in awe of, and I don't know that I would be able to do this myself, when I think about with empathy and like a lot of what I do, I read a lot, I write a lot, you can listen to my podcast, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, but a lot of what keeps me up at night is how do these people do this? How does my friend Bassam still stay with good humor and smiling and on the Zoom with me, tell me that we just want something a little bit better and we can live with these people? And why don't we have leaders in the Palestinian Authority and in Israel as well who actually see this is what most of us want? And that's what pains me the most, is that I can't write an article about that. I can't speak in front of groups like this enough to basically instill that in some of our leadership. And I if you guys have any ideas on all of that, but what I'm trying to say in answer to your question is it's not as bad as what you painted, but what makes it bad is how it's refracted through our politics, through Israel's politics, through Palestinian politics, through our media. And we forget that basic decency that I think is at the core of most ordinary Palestinians. And I wrote, when I wrote one of the first articles about my friend Bassam, one of my father's friends wrote back to me and he said, your friend is going to get what he deserves, he and his family. And I was like, what? And he said, because they voted for Hamas and things like this. And I was like, Bassam didn't vote for Hamas any more than I voted for Donald Trump in the last election. But he lives there, and he lives with the consequences of what their leadership actually has to say. But he's still a decent person, and he's not become an extremist as a result of all of these actions and things like that. He sees the shades of gray. What I fear is that the leadership in this country, in Israel, in Palestine in particular, do not see those shades of gray. And I think part of the answer is something beyond what a think tank or others can do. It's just simply reminding people, be a decent human being.
Given the role that American foreign policy plays, and given that you mentioned the USAID, how do you optimize the difference between the offensive realism of John Mearsheimer and the defensive realism of Jeffrey Sachs?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So. I mean, but both of them. So John Mearsheimer is a political scientist at the University of Chicago, and I studied him. Was on a panel with him once about 15 years ago, and respected analyst. But And Jeffrey Sachs was a little bit more liberal, and you framed it, sorry, as offensive versus defensive realism. Yeah. Explain to me the defensive realism part. Sorry, get up back to the mic. Yeah.
Defensive realism would be support for the USAID and the United States Institute of Peace.
Yeah, so the difference between the two is this. And Mearsheimer, I think, erroneously says that USAID and a lot of these NGOs, including ones I worked for in the 1990s, in Palestine and Egypt and other places. Mearsheimer would say these are, he has a line about this infrastructure that sounds suspiciously like Vladimir Putin, that these are tools of U.S. imperialism to tear down sort of Russia and all these other societies, whereas Sachs is like, no, that's not what this is going on here, and we need to support people around the world. I think the dominant, not that you asked this, but I think the dominant mode right now in the Trump approach, and it's still early, this guy can change. I don't know if you've noticed this. He's quite unpredictable. He sort of is like, which way is the wind blowing? I think the dominant mode is a bit more Mearsheimer than Sachs. And that's why you've got not only the destruction of USAID, but we have colleagues, friends who are at U.S. Institute for Peace, Wilson Center, and all of these things that were built up with bipartisan support. And this is where I appeal to you, Roy, and the World Affairs Councils around the region, the country. Where's your voice in all of this? Because this is an important sort of issue of how do you rally to support these sorts of things. And again, Sachs, both of them, I think, have a bit too much of a blame America first approach. And having worked on democracy and freedom programs with NGOs, this is not CIA stuff to do regime change. This is very soft. When I was in Palestine, we were doing this. We brought in people from Romania and others who have been part of transition countries in the Cold War, after the Cold War ended. And how do you actually organize basic, and this became sort of the tools to help people in Egypt, for instance, turn over the regime that was committing abuses in terms of human rights and things like this, but it wasn't about a geopolitical, we're interested in them. And I think, but Mearsheimer basically, I think his way of thinking has informed a lot of what the Trump Doge approach to gutting and cutting all of this. Does that make sense? What's that?
Too much so?
Oh, too much so, completely. And I'm not somebody who says, okay, we've lost that battle. It's over. By and large. VOA, it's not. National Endowment for Democracy, it's not. But it is, there was a court case yesterday for USIP. But all of these things, if you're sort of boxing back against the frame, these people came in, and the most chilling thing for me, I don't know if people notice this, but RFK Jr., the Health and Human Services Secretary, when he was sworn in, and he basically said a lot of these entities like USAID, he said they were tools for regime change around the world. And that's sort of just taken the lines of our adversaries and competitors and just putting it out there in your own bully puppet. And that's the worst thing you can do. Because what was actually happening was you were helping people who wanted to make their lives a little bit better, and you're facilitating basically an aggressive approach to support authoritarianism around the world, and perhaps in America too.
How do you see what kind of solution do you see in this? You've been on both sides. You know both sides intimately. What's the future for this? This war can't go on forever.
Yeah. So it can't go on forever, but you've only got about 2 million people, Palestinians, who live in Gaza. At a certain point, the end point needs to be defined by the Israelis who have the power in the military campaign, what it is they want to see. And this is part of the problem that Israel has today. And I say this with great regret as a supporter of Israel. They are committing the same mistakes that the United States did in Iraq and Afghanistan, in that they're not defining this is a viable end state. And why are they not doing that? Because they got different factions in the current government and different voices. Some of the factions say we should take all of it back and kick all the Palestinians out to Egypt and Jordan and other places. Others are like, no. But Biden warned them of this in the first couple of weeks of the war. They said, don't do what we did. And the biggest thing I tell people, young folks who work with me in life and things like this, is focus more on what you want to actually see as the end state in your life rather than what you're against. What are you in favor of and what do you want to achieve? And to this day, and we just, at Middle East Institute, we had a 4-hour session with people from CENTCOM, the U.S. military command in the Middle East yesterday, private off the record. And this was like the top experts who are dealing with this in the U.S. government, on the military command. They don't know the answer to the question of what is Israel's political leadership wants to see. Yes, they want to see the end of Hamas and the defeat of this threat and October 7th and things like this, but they will never utter the two-state solution today because they see this as a reward potentially to Hamas for what they did. But what I would say, and the bigger, broader end state, Roy, needs to involve not just the Israel-Palestine question, but Iran. And why does that sound like too expansive? But if you want to deal with a country like Iran, which has used the Palestinian question for its own ideological purposes for decades and has squandered so many resources in giving money to Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups. And if you want to deal with the very real security threats and insecurities that Israel feels and faces every day, you need some sort of security pact that essentially says two things. Number one, we're actually going to thwart the threat that Iran has posed to Israel and its neighbors, not only through its nuclear program, which was sketch, but its support for terrorism and different groups like this. But then second, we're going to be boldly in favor of a two-state solution, which goes against the odds of the current Israeli government that wants to annex parts of the West Bank and wants to take back parts of Gaza. So the solution to Gaza has got to be part of the broader sort of wind set of what the region looks like. And why is that important? Also because of what the Saudis and Qataris and the UAE the resources they can bring to bear. Because U.S. taxpayers are not going to pay for this. Israelis are not going to pay for this. But these countries would be willing to, but their quid pro quo is essentially we need a Palestinian state. So I think that's what it looks like. It needs a different leadership amongst the Palestinians. And as crazy as it sounds, I actually think it'll happen in the 2030s.
Okay, let's move a little bit from Gaza. I want to give Israeli credit about situation in Lebanon and Syria.
Yeah.
And how you see that will be big picture of the Middle East. And now I don't see Trump administration have some people who will think different policy from the past.
Yeah.
Because United States used to force like a multi-ethnicity instead of going step by step, you know.
Yeah. So first of all, like to be clear, I think the Trump administration is their number one lean is to get other countries to pull their weight. And are you Turkish? I forget. He's not. I think they're going to lean on countries like Turkey and others that have resources and capabilities that we have, but we don't want to use in the Middle East to actually produce outcomes in ways that I think Roy will see this. I would predict on your trip to Syria is that the hand and influence, despite Trump's announcement on the sanctions on Syria, Turkey is there. It backed the current leaders of Syria. And I think part of what Trump's approach will be is to get others to pull their weight and to do more to support the Syrian people. We're not going to be sending troops to any of these places. Gaza Riviera plan notwithstanding, Trump's not doing that. Like U.S. troops are not going to Gaza or any other places. I'm highly skeptical that we're going to war in Iran at all because I think they're seeking a diplomatic pathway. So I think the new template that, Obama and Biden, in a sense, sort of danced around, but Trump himself is fully implementing, is to get other countries to put their money, their resources, and perhaps their troops to actually help stabilize these countries. And I think Turkey is going to be a key part of that. We should recognize that Turkey itself has its own challenges with its own democracy and the top opposition leader in jail at this point. So building these alliances and these partnerships come with some cost to our values, come with some cost to the thing I was ranting about before, about who we are as America and how we engage this part of the world. But it is what it is, and you can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And that's why I think this approach of essentially what Trump did, the biggest top line so far, I have not seen what he said in the UAE, but I think the biggest headline is the fact that we're lifting sanctions on Syria. We're encouraging others to actually help Syria stand on its own. And I think, the notion of helping Syria be great again, despite the divisions between Alawites and Sunnis, Kurds and Arabs, I think is an important template for where this country can go.
Why is Jordan taking a backseat during the second Trump administration?
I lived in Jordan, by the way. I was a Fulbright scholar there in 1994-95. And on my podcast, which you should listen to, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, next month you'll hear Dina Kawar, the Jordanian ambassador to the U.S., as one of my guests. I would say that Jordan understands its role in the region, and it's not really taking a back seat because one of the first Arab leaders that Trump met in the White House was King Abdullah of Jordan in the first couple of weeks. And it wasn't a great meeting in terms of the optics, but the outcome was, I think, very important for Jordan. Before the meeting, Trump was saying, well, Jordan should take millions of Palestinians from Gaza, and we're going to cut aid to Jordan and things like this. And he was trying to pressure Jordan. And King Abdullah came into the White House and essentially said, President Trump, this is sort of a formula a lot of these countries use. We're going to take 2,000 cancer patients from Gaza, kids, and we're going to bring them to Jordan. And Trump was like, wow, this is amazing. And the formula that they use is this, is like you do the thing that you're already doing and you say, because he's not that informed, unfortunately, for whatever reasons. And he was amazed by all of this. So he got a pass on all of this. Jordan, I think, is playing its own quiet game of influence. It's poorer. It doesn't have the jumbo jets and the resources that Qatar and other places do. But it uses the power of diplomacy and personal relationships to basically say, look, we're integral to this part of the region. We're a key partner. And Jordan, for decades, has worked with the United States in the fight against al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other places. We've offered support, and I think that's going to continue. And again, I'll talk about this with Ambassador Kawar on the podcast next month. So it's sort of after the Abdullah-Trump visit, it's adopted more of a low profile, and it's happy to do that because it continues the cooperation with the United States on key fronts in the fight against terrorism, in the push towards some sort of notion of what does an Israel-Palestine solution look like. Jordan will be central to that. So I don't think it's taken a back seat. It's sort of playing sort of its cards in a proper way in a second Trump administration.
The war has gone on for 19 months in Gaza, but there's been spin-offs. Hezbollah in Lebanon has been dealt a severe setback, and the Iranians have been dealt a severe setback, and Syria is no longer in the Iranian camp, so you have a whole different constellation right now. What do you expect this will lead to, or has it led to the Donald Trump trip?
So I think what this might lead to is the thing I was talking about on Iran. If we get to an Iran nuclear deal, which I suspect might look similar to what Obama brokered, it'll lead to another conversation with Iran about its regional approach and its proxies. And that, again, is one that will involve the region. But simply put, and our colleague Alex Vatanka, who's our top Iran expert, you should read his work day in and day out. The Islamic Republic of Iran is at its weakest point since it came to office in 1979, since the revolution. And if the Iranian regime is wise, it would have this discussion about how to recalibrate after the Iran nuclear program is dealt with, how to recalibrate its presence in the region. Because a lot of its neighbors for decades have been concerned about its efforts to export the revolution, to support groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And now that these groups are down, but not out, severely weakened, the fact that they've lost the Assad regime in Syria, that some of the groups in Iraq are at a much weaker point, this is an opportunity to actually bring Iran, if it makes the choice, more deeply into the region, not through proxy actors and through this axis of resistance, but one that actually integrates them with the rest of the world. And the one thing to watch for, I meant to mention this in terms of watching this, there's a really interesting conversation that's being had in Muscat and Oman and other places about what a solution might look like about Iran on its nuclear program. And it involves this. It's a regional nuclear fuel bank that involves America and other places. And people have talked about this. It's not a new idea, but it's come to the fore again. And it's one where, with safeguards from the International Atomic Energy Agency, with the United States supporting Israel and some of its partners in the region, could be an interesting thing. But the key question that Iran faces and the regime faces, to answer your question, Roy, is it willing to pull back from its investments in the Houthis in Yemen, in the Hezbollah in Lebanon? Is it willing to live as a normal nation that isn't trying to upend the order in the Middle East, but wants to build normal diplomatic and commercial relations with some of its neighbors? So I'll end on that.
Well, I thank you. I think that you've given us a context for a lot of events going on in a lot of places in different directions. And I think you've given us an assessment of President Trump's trip that I certainly have not read anywhere else. And I think it's extremely valuable to have you